Theoretical solidarity is not solidarity. So being with people requires sacrificing our bodies, and that's what I'm doing, and I won't turn back on that. I won't look back.
Hello, I'm Lydia Talbot for the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Welcome to Sanctuary, presented at the First United Methodist Church, Chicago Temple, in partnership with the Chicago Sunday Evening Club. What's the real struggle and story behind the headlines and controversy between Professor Larycia Hawkins and Wheaton College? Dr. Hawkins is a Christian who declared she was wearing a Muslim headscarf for Advent to express her solidarity with Muslims facing hostility and rising Islamophobia. Wheaton College, a private evangelical Christian school, says it suspended Professor Hawkins for a Facebook post she wrote that says Muslims, Christians, and Jews worship the same God, and the suspension is in no way related to her race, gender, or her commitment to wear a headscarf in solidarity with Muslims. Hawkins attributes her same God statement to Pope Francis, but the college says it is inconsistent with its doctrinal convictions. In the next half hour, we'll take you behind the headlines for a close-up on the issues at stake that will challenge what you think about your politics and your faith today on Sanctuary.
On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of the Chicago Sunday Evening Club, I wish to welcome you to our first conversation at the Chicago Temple. Please express your welcome for Professor Larycia Hawkins and Ahmed Rahab. The Pope made several statements, and I'm going to read one of them in context tonight, and I'm going to ask both of our guests to respond. So when the Pope was inaugurated, and at several points, including the week before Professor Hawkins made her first sort of public statement about these matters, the Pope said something like this, and so I'm going to quote. This is from his inaugural address in 2013. "And now I turn to you," he says, "distinguished representatives of the Jewish people, to whom we, the Catholics, are bound by a very special spiritual bond. From the moment that, as the Second Vatican Council said, quote, thus the Church of Christ acknowledges that according to God's saving design, the beginnings of her faith and her election are found already among the patriarchs, Moses and the prophets," unquote. And that's from a Catholic document called Nostra Aetate. "I thank you for your presence and trust that with the help of the Almighty, we can continue the fruitful fraternal dialogue that the Council wished for, that it is actually achieved, bringing many fruits, especially during the last decades." So the Pope turns to the Jewish representatives at his inauguration, and that's what he says. And then he turns to the Muslim representatives at the inauguration, and he says this: "I greet and thank cordially all of you, dear friends belonging to other religious traditions, firstly, the Muslims, who worship the one living and merciful God and call upon him in prayer. I really appreciate your presence, and in it I see a tangible sign of the wish to grow in reciprocal trust and in cooperation for the common good of humanity." So here we have the leader of the Catholic Church reaching out to two non-Christian communities and offering hospitality and welcome. And in particular to the Muslim community, he recognizes them as ones who worship the one living and merciful God. And so I'd like to begin my question tonight with Mr. Rahab, and to say, when you and other members of the Muslim community have heard the Pope make statements like this, how have you heard these statements? What has been your interpretation of what the Pope has meant by this?
We took his statements at face value for the proper and good meaning that they contained. We saw him as a man who was far removed from the politics of religion and who was sincere about his beliefs and his views of others, that helped him create rhetoric that is targeted towards bringing people together. Not by inventing facts, but by pointing to actual existing facts, and that is that there is one God, according to all three Abrahamic faiths, and really any monotheistic faith, and that we worship the same God. And that is something I absolutely believe.
Okay.
And I think that's what Larycia was pointing to as well.
Well, and so with that, let's turn to you, Dr. Hawkins. And when you heard the Pope making statements like this, now let's put it on the table. Usually for evangelicals, the Pope is not an authority. Is that fair to say?
Depends on whom you ask.
Okay, fair enough.
I will say, as an evangelical, I think we're all Catholic. And I say that, not because you're sitting next to me, because it can't be other than true that Protestants are of one and the same holy Catholic small c faith. And that the same church fathers that Protestants point to, Catholics point to. The same creeds that Protestant creeds are derivative of are those rooted in the early church fathers and mothers as well, who are often neglected. So to say that the Pope is not an authority, well, in a hierarchical ecclesiastical sense, yes, that's true. But in another sense, I would regularly assign in my classes at Wheaton College papal encyclicals. Students weren't necessarily happy reading Rerum Novarum from the 19th century, but it's an important piece about the dignity of labor and capitalism and communism, or how we can think about faith and reason together, so fides et ratio. So whether the Pope's an authority or not depends on whom you ask, but in terms of matters of faith, there's a saying, in all essentials unity. And so to that end, I look to the Pope, yes, for guidance about issues and questions of faith.
Now I want to make two clarifications. One, when you say Catholic, you mean that in a little c sense, meaning universal. Mm-hmm. Okay, and not...
But I also mean that we're all Catholic in the sense of we're derivative of the same Abrahamic tradition, and Protestants are, Martin Luther was the 95 Theses, which we were about to celebrate, and this is derivative. Martin Luther was seeking to reform the church from within the church. So we also can't lose sight of our own Protestant origins in that.
So we have a common root in the Catholic Church, even if the branch may have diverged. The other clarification that I want to make is that you were not assigning these texts, Rerum Novarum and others, fides et ratio, in a theology class, but rather in political science classes.
Yes, absolutely.
And why is that significant?
It's significant to me because some of the holes within the development of, like my good Jamaican friend says, Protestantism, are this. We don't have a developed way of thinking. We don't have a Catholic social thought. We don't have an equivalent for Protestants. So maybe mainlines think about it this way. Anabaptists and the peace traditions think about it this way. But there's not an evangelical, kind of unified evangelical political thought. I have political philosopher friends who are working on correcting that. But I look to a document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, to help my students think through how to live out justice in the public realm, justice that is God's justice. And so I do look to Catholic social teaching and the tradition of the church, as well as to other denominational documents as well, Protestant denominational documents, I should say.
Thank you. And Mr. Dr. Hawkins has just been talking about sort of the infighting that happens in the Christian tradition between Protestants and Catholics. Does that ever filter through to Muslims? Do Muslims, are they aware that there are these kind of fractures within the Christian church? Or from the outside, is the Muslim knowledge of Christianity that it's pretty much a monolithic sort of thing?
It's a very interesting question. I also think it depends on who you ask, but I think common knowledge is that Christianity is a very wide tent with various different interpretations, some of which are at sort of in contention with one another, and others that absolutely are in tandem. But generally, we understand the basic creed of Christianity to be to permeate all of these various sects and traditions of Christianity: the belief in God, the belief in acts of good, the belief in staying away from acts of evil. We see Christianity as a good religion, as a religion of God.
So part of the context out of which circumstances that brought us here tonight arose have to do with the long history of anti-Muslim sentiment in this country. We might say that anti-Muslim sentiment is perhaps at a fever pitch right now in many ways in our political rhetoric and also in our religious rhetoric. And so, for example, in early December of last year, the head of Liberty University, President Jerry Falwell Jr., encouraged students to apply for concealed weapons permits so that they could, quote, end those Muslims. And I want to make sure that you understand that that's a direct quotation, and that I'm not pulling this just out of context. That was heard by students at Wheaton and responded to by students at Wheaton in a way that says, this person does not speak for our understanding of evangelicalism. And so for part of how we place what is going on with Dr. Hawkins in context, that's part of what was in the air at the time that all this was happening. So we've begun with the quotation from the Pope. I now have this short quotation from Jerry Falwell Jr., and so I now turn to Dr. Hawkins and say, what were you thinking?
What do you mean, what was I thinking? What was he thinking? What was Jerry Falwell Jr. thinking?
Yeah.
Is the appropriate question.
Yes.
I also think the appropriate question is, who are we and who are we becoming?
Mm.
That in our country, it's a sobering thing. That in our country, that's acceptable rhetoric. That's what I was thinking. That a president at the helm of a Christian college, and I'm not questioning the verity of his faith, or the stature and esteem of that university. But what I was thinking was, who the hell do we think we are, that we allow that to proliferate as political, religio-political rhetoric? It's a damn shame. It's a shame. It's not okay. It's not okay for my nephew, who is a millennial, to be subject to those kinds of iterations anywhere in this polity. And I'm not interested in bracketing free speech. I'm interested in civil discourse, especially from people who call themselves religionists or people of no faith at all, who say they believe in a plural polity where we celebrate our differences. Even as we diverge on issues, we come together and we converge around certain kinds of values. And I'm also actually the last person to rally around the flag, but there are certain principles that we hold as ideal and true, and we're a country that has not lived up to our ideals from the beginning. But we're also a country that works to rectify our failures, and that is a failure. So he's not a failure, that was a failure. So we can all fail in similar ways. Prayerfully, we don't fail publicly in those kinds of ways. He's in a public platform, so grace is to be given to all of us who have platforms. May we use them in ways that uphold the dignity of other people. And so it was grievous to me. It made me angry, but I was also very proud that the authors of the letter emailed me after they had written it and said, this is what we did. Do you have any suggestions? And I was like, no. Great, go.
And so you felt like that was a fulfillment in some ways of what you had been teaching in the classroom?
Absolutely. To see students, to see young people, to see millennials live out the values that we talk about. We want them to. I'm not concerned about the next generation. I'm concerned about us. I'm concerned about Gen Xers. I'm concerned about baby boomers. I'm concerned about the great generation. That we've made peace with these kinds of oppression, and that what these students did was to say, hell no, we won't make peace with that kind of oppression in God's name. In God's name, we will say, we will speak on behalf of other people. We will be presumptuous enough to speak on behalf of our whole institution and our whole student body and say, we don't stand for that. We love our Muslim neighbors.
you also chose to take a public witness of your own, and that public witness sort of took two prongs. And again, I want to put a bright line around the sort of circumstances at Wheaton, but there are some aspects of it that I want to speak about in terms of your personal journey. You chose as a sort of public witness to wear the hijab, and you also made some public statements that referenced this position of the Pope that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. I found it very interesting that you chose to quote the Pope and you didn't instead stand on your own authority. And so now that I actually have you here, I want to ask you, was that intentional in terms of appealing to the Pope's statement? Instead of saying, this is what Larycia Hawkins says, I'm just echoing what the Pope says as I'm putting on the hijab.
I can tell you that I don't remember at the time as I was typing the Facebook post, but I can tell you that in the week or two prior to my Facebook post, most of the post was really about, all of the post was really about embodied solidarity. And several weeks prior, Pope Francis had epitomized embodied solidarity by going to the most despised, the least, the last place in the world that anyone thinks about, the Central African Republic. Most people don't even know the country exists. It's in the midst of a civil war. And the Pope went there because what he decided to do was go and stand in solidarity with Muslims who were being oppressed by Christian militias. And he said in the context of that visit, we worship the same God, to Muslims who were being surrounded outside their church by Christian militias. He risked his life to go to the most forgotten place on the globe, one of the poorest countries by all standards. That's what he did. And I actually posted on it on my Facebook page. No one sees that Facebook post. But the Facebook post said something like, mark my words. I talked about how this was embodied solidarity. Mark my words, he will be called an apostate and a heretic for doing it. Well, it was me. But it was that act as well that was probably in the back of my mind, that Pope Francis would do that. And that's it. That's what it's about. And also that it was the midst of Advent. That was the bigger picture. But the idea of invoking the Pope was probably me thinking back to what the Pope had just done on behalf of his Muslim brothers and sisters in the Central African Republic.
A non-Muslim decides to put on a visible identification with Muslim culture and Muslim religiosity, the hijab. How was that received and seen in the Chicago Muslim community?
I think for me and for many others in the Muslim community, it sort of hit us like a cool glass of water in a hot, arid desert. It was something that stuck out positively as a surprise that somebody would care enough to do something like this. We had sort of accustomed ourselves to hearing and seeing the very opposite. The terrain is not very good for Muslims in America today. We hear candidates who come out to tell us that we should be banned from entering the United States as a security measure, and they're talking about all Muslims. We hear candidates that question whether Muslims can run for president merely because they're Muslim, despite the constitutional guarantees that religion will not be a determining factor in who can run and who can't. And we, in the media, hear everyday pundits and anchors and guests and talking heads questioning our faith, whether it's a violent faith. And they're not talking about the traditions or the ideologies of terrorists or extremists, but rather the sort of the white tent Islam, unqualified, whether that, and it's emblazoned as a caption on the bottom, not just of Fox News, mind you, but CNN and other mainstream venues, questioning. My son, he's too young now, but anybody's son, anybody's child just can turn on TV and there's a question, are you a violent person by nature? Is the question really? And that's what we got sort of accustomed to. And so when we saw somebody like Larycia stand up and say, I will stand with you, I'll stand in solidarity with you, even by a symbolic act such as this. And it was very surprising and disappointing to see that of all the people that said things about Islam and Muslims, that it would be Larycia that would sort of rock the boat and that somebody would find a problem with her statement and her stance versus all of the other things that we've heard, including from evangelical leaders who are quite up there in the scale of things, not just like Jerry Falwell Jr., but
Yes.
Franklin Graham
Yes.
as well, the son of Billy Graham, who said some terrible things about Islam and Muslims. So this was really a great, moment for us.
So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Hawkins, and this is in the pointed question category. Dr. Hawkins, if we all worship the same God, but different ways, why don't you one day worship in the Muslim way, go to a mosque? And then another day, why don't you go to a Christian church? And then why don't you also go perhaps to a Hindu ashram or some other worship space?
So saying that Muslims, Christians, and Jews worship, so again, I'll go back, right, to my previous point. So let's take Muslims out of the equation. Do Jews and Christians worship the same God? This is a question that every Christian has to ask themselves. Let's leave Muslims aside, right? And I think some Christians are actually at the point of, in the midst of this actually international conversation that's been spurred, are willing to jettison God's chosen people in favor of saying, if being consistent, actually, which I applaud that, that in order to say that Muslims do not worship the same God, that they are not of the same Abrahamic faith.
So what do we hope comes next from this and for us in this? And so I ask Mr. Rahab, and then I'll ask Dr. Hawkins.
What gives me hope are people who are willing to go against the grain of things, against currents, for the sake of doing what's right and for the right reasons. What gives me hope are people who are willing to love as loudly as those who hate.
Mm-hmm.
They're very loud. Those voices are very loud. And oftentimes, even though they're a minority, within Islam, by the way, within Islam, the extremists are very loud, and you hear them all the time. All you got to do is turn on your TV set, or the radio, or pick up your newspaper. They'll make your headlines, because what they do is loud by nature. Bombs, killings, etc. And because they're so loud, you might think that they're the only voice that's out there. And likewise, those on the flip side of things who are anti-Muslim, for example, are very loud and vociferous in their hate and their bigotry. They're very confident. They're very assertive. They're very almost everywhere that you look. And so when we find people who are willing on both sides, right, to love us loudly, to not be meek, because we are the majority. We are still the majority. But we're a silent majority. And oftentimes we just shake our heads from left to right and just move on. Whereas they invest money in projects and programs and organizations and initiatives and cable stations and newspapers and blogs and et cetera, et cetera. We have to have an actionable love, embodied solidarity. There has to be a qualification for every good virtue that we have that is either embodied or active, so that it's out there making change. We start to understand that we do speak the same language, the same human language.
What I hope comes from this is a real interfaith, multi-faith, people of no faith movement of justice, period. All religions believe in justice. Our Constitution and our government, the role of government, the normative goal of government is to do justice in the public realm. And what I hope comes from this is people who will make what the Book of Common Prayer says, make no peace with oppression, in the prayer for social justice, that we would make no peace with oppression. And part of that is having the eyes to see people in their oppression and fearlessly contending against the evil xenophobia. It's not just rhetoric, it's action. It's structural violence that's happening by denigrating mosques and things that we think, we pick up the paper and it's on the front page and we go, why is that on the front page? Because it's violence. But one thing that's happened in the wake of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice is, I hope, with an understanding of embodied solidarity, people will really realize that the first thing, you can't do embodied solidarity unless you have eyes to see bodies. Bodies matter. Black lives matter, but black bodies matter. And if you don't believe that black bodies matter, that humans matter, that Muslims matter. They're not a sideshow in our polity, a nuisance to be, handled and dealt with because of the whole ISIS thing, right? No. When President Obama goes to a mosque in Baltimore and children greet him, shows how his body being there matters. So bodies matter, and it's a great heresy of the church, the Christian church, that bodies don't matter, that only the spirit matters. And we need to recapture a theopolitical imagination that says Muslim bodies matter, black bodies matter, gay bodies matter. Whatever you think about gay marriage, gay bodies matter. All bodies matter. Whether you believe that on a basis of faith, our Constitution says that bodies matter. Millennials, they give me hope. They give me hope. Jesus is my hope, but millennials give me hope because they believe that bodies matter. They get something that the old crotchety people don't get because we've read too many books and seen too much destruction, so we've made peace with oppression. But they haven't. They're paralyzed by it. But that's my job, to teach them, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly, to love their neighbor just because they're their neighbor, not because they're Muslim and they need special attention. Just love them. So that gives me hope.
Thank you.
We're glad you've been with us for this edition of Sanctuary at the First United Methodist Church, Chicago Temple, in partnership with the Chicago Sunday Evening Club. Your thoughts and reactions to issues and ideas at the intersection of life and faith are important to us, and we want to hear from you. Email us at gcbm@ameritech.net, visit our website at gcbm.org, and write to us at Sanctuary in care of the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries, 77 West Washington Street, Chicago 60602. That's Sanctuary, the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries, 77 West Washington, Chicago 60602. We close now with this thought from the mission statement of the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries: to embrace diversity, to heal, to offer a vision of hope, and thereby serve the whole human family, to use the medium of television to reveal the mystery of God's love manifested in human life and all creation. Thanks for keeping faith with us today on Sanctuary. I'm Lydia Talbot. May peace be with you.
Thank you.